Henry Ford was an American industrialist well known for developing the assembly line. Ford's first interactions with automotive assembly were in Detroit machine shops, where he first came in contact with the internal combustion engine. After years of experimentation, Henry established the Ford Motor Company in 1903. Wanting to improve production efficiency, Henry tested different production techniques, and in 1913, he implemented the assembly line technique into the automotive assembly process, revolutionizing the manufacturing of automobiles. Not only did Henry and the Ford Company revolutionize the efficiency of automotive assembly, they also revolutionized the wages and working conditions of the automotive factory workers for the better. The utilization of the assembly line also shifted the composition and type of workers in the Ford factories, from skilled craftsmen to unskilled immigrant workers. These men could obtain good wages despite their lack of skill due to Henry raising the industry standard of factory workers' salaries. Henry furthermore revolutionized the accessibility of automobiles, as the assembly line allowed automobiles to be sold at prices affordable to the middle and working classes. By the early 20th century, hundreds of car manufacturers were established in America, but the cost of the automobiles were too high for the average American. Automobiles were in turn scarce, as only the wealthiest of Americans could afford them. The exorbitant cost of the automobiles was primarily due to the technique they were using for assembly. As Henry Ford stated, "In our first assembling, we simply started to put a car together as spot on the floor, and workmen brought to it the parts they were needed in exactly the same way that one builds a house." This procedure was both slow and tedious, making the process of automobile production expensive for the manufacturer. Aside from the factory owner, the employees who assembled the automobiles worked in subpar conditions and made, on average, only $2.50 an hour. Henry Ford's automotive goal was to build a motor car for the great multitude. It will be constructed of the best materials by the best men to be hired, but it will be so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one. Henry's goal came to fruition when his assembly line significantly reduced the production costs of the Ford automobiles. The first Ford automobile to be mass-produced using the assembly line technique was the Ford Model T. The price of the Model T was able to be lowered from $850 in 1908 to only $300 in 1924. The affordable prices of Ford's automobiles significantly increased the number of car-owning individuals in America. In the early 1900s, there were approximately 8,000 automobiles in use, but by the 1930s, there were nearly 23 million. Aside from the assembly line's impacts on automobile customers, the type of automotive worker shifted as, prior to Henry's automotive assembly line, skilled craftsmen made up the majority of the workforce, representing around 40% at the end of the 19th century. This was because the former automotive assembly process required educated workers that could perform all of the complicated steps of assembling an automobile. The switch to an assembly line in the Ford factories divided the assembly process into steps, each of which would be performed by the workers stationed at their particular step. Workers then only had to know how to perform one part of the assembly process, which lowered the skill requirements of being a Ford automotive worker. When the assembly line technique was implemented in the Ford factories, they employed numerous unskilled laborers as both machine assemblers and operators. By 1917, the majority of Ford factory workers transitioned from skilled craftsmen to unskilled workers, who then represented 55% of the Ford workforce. This shift of skilled to unskilled workers in the Ford factories had noticeable impacts on the power of the individual worker, as unskilled laborers were far easier to replace than the former skilled craftsmen. Apart from the type, the composition of workers also transitioned, as the percent of immigrants in the Ford factories was approximately 75% by 1914. The wage of a Ford factory worker was very high for the time, making a good opportunity for those who weren't educated or who were immigrants to get a good salary. The high wages of these workers were due to Henry Ford's $5 day, which, although seemed like a decision based purely on Henry's kindness, was truly a clever approach to solving the issue of the factory workers' high turnover rate, while also increasing the number of Model T customers. The high staff attrition rate was primarily due to the assembly job being repetitive and monotonous, an aspect of work many of the Ford factory workers found unsatisfactory. A constant supply of workers was necessary for the assembly process, so Henry Ford increased the wages and reduced the working hours to improve worker satisfaction, thus increasing worker retention. Specifically, Ford raised the hourly wage from the industrial standard of $2.43 to $5. He also reduced the 9-hour workday to 8 and the 48-hour work week to 40. The workers were then receiving double the industrial standard for hourly pay and had more leisure time. Soon, other automobile companies had to increase their factory workers' salaries and lower their hours to keep them from leaving and working for Ford Motors. Ford's changes ensured a stable workforce in the Ford factories and revolutionized the industry standard for factory workers' salaries and working hours. Apart from the high wages and lower working hours, the Ford factories were characterized by their excellent working conditions. Ford had a team of over 1,000 men cleaning their facilities, keeping the factories as clean as possible for their workers. There were also well-equipped medical facilities at the Ford compounds. There were 9 doctors and 28 first aid men in attendance at all times, and they were provided with high-quality equipment. A prime example of Ford's high standards of cleanliness was the installation of spittoons in his automated factories to prevent the workers from sullying the factory floors. Joe Wash, a man whose father worked for Ford in the 1930s, said, "One thing about Henry, he wanted our machinery clean. He wanted the floor clean. People used to chew tobacco and then spit, while the corners of the stairs would be painted white, because that's where they'd spit. And if you see any spit on there, he wasn't for it." Apart from Ford's positive impact on hygiene in the automated factories, Henry also revolutionized the transportation industry. First of all, as automobiles became standard among the working class, they allowed workers the freedom to work in the city without the restraint of having to live there. The phenomena of living and working in 2 separate locations has led to complete dependence upon the automobile, ultimately having detrimental effects on our environment. Secondly, Henry's implementation of the $5 day and 40-hour work week for factory workers created a new industry standard of higher wages and more leisure time. These higher wages benefited the working class by creating socioeconomic upward mobility, dramatically expanding the American middle class. In addition, due to the price drop in cars, more people owned and drove automobiles, leading to the creation of entirely new industries for automobile parts and fuel. In particular, the gas industry grew exponentially with the Model T release, as from 1920 to 1930, the number of gas stations went from 15,000 to 100,000. The abundance of car-owning persons also led to the development of the roads and highways we have today. As a result of new road networks, travel became exponentially more accessible, allowing people and ideas to spread faster than ever before. To conclude, Henry Ford was an American industrialist whose implementation of the assembly line revolutionized the automotive manufacturing process while dramatically impacting the automotive workforce. The automotive manufacturing process before Henry's assembly line was inefficient, leading to the prices of the automobiles produced being too high for the American working and middle class. The efficiency of the automotive assembly line drastically decreased the prices of automobiles to the point where they were affordable to the average American. Within the automotive factories, the assembly line shifted the composition and type of workers from the majority being American-born, skilled craftsmen to immigrant, unskilled laborers. Henry's pro-worker policies created a new industry standard, acting as a catalyst for upward mobility within the working class.